In this class we'll look at the communications process. Now the material in this class is straightforward, so it should not pose too big a problem. Nonetheless, we need to look at the different aspects of the communications process. So to start, communications ranges from a message to a signal. So communications is simply anything that communicates information from one person, let's say the sender, to another person, let's say the receiver. So it ranges from a message, it could be written, it could be in different formats, or it could be just simply a signal, a wave of the hand. So communications can take a wide variety of formats. So it could be a hand gesture, or it could be some sort of facial expression that communicates a message. It could be body language, how people are standing or acting or how they look, the expression on their face perhaps. It could be a conversation which could be written, or it could be oral. It could be two people talking, perhaps on a telephone or talking face to face, or perhaps it's written. It could be an email or a memo written between them. So communications is a two-way process which involves a sender who encodes and sends the message. So that's necessary. It's necessary to have a sender who encodes the message, who devises the message, who encodes it, and who then sends it. And a receiver who decodes the message and is able to respond appropriately. So we have two agents involved in the communications process, the sender and the receiver. Communications is only effective if appropriate media and channels of communication are used to convey the message. So it's essential that the communications uses appropriate media. It needs to use the appropriate channels of communication to convey the message. For example, if the sender is in one country and the other person's in a different country, then it would be silly to stand waving your arms about, because the other person's not going to see that. A phone call might be more effective, or an email, or a video conference. So an appropriate media is essential. So the media is how the message will be communicated. It could be, as I said, oral, written, visual, electronic, whatever format, but it must be appropriate given the situation of the communications. The delivery of the medium could be face-to-face, telephone, letter, email, fax, conference, meeting. It can be in a whole variety of formats. So the communications is only effective if appropriate media and channels of communication are used to convey the message. Now let's look at a very simple model of communications, and one that we'll just talk about for the rest of this session. The model we look at looks at communications as expressed as a cycle, and it starts quite simply with a sender, and the sender encodes a message. The sender devises a message and then encodes the message, getting it ready, suitable for communications. The sender must select a medium, some way of sending the message. How will the message be sent to the receivers? What medium will be used? And then, of course, it must be decoded by the receiver. So the receiver receives it and decodes it. And of course, the receiver may then send feedback to the sender to express that he or she has received the message, or the message is understood, the communications has been effective, in other words. So there is some sort of feedback, and that's what we mean by the cycle. Of course, in all of this, there are things which can go wrong. Interference. And interference is sometimes called noise. Noise is anything which distorts the message or stops the message from getting through, stops the communications. And let's look at ways in which all of this happens. We'll just go through these in a little more detail. Let's start with the sender and encoding. Well, the individual who initiates the message, now this could be, the message could be an idea, something that somebody has which is just simply very vague, but it needs to be communicated. Perhaps it needs more attention, it needs to be considered by other people. It's an idea at the moment. It could be, of course, information, which is the result of some sort of data processing. Information is the outcome from data analysis and data consideration. Having got a data set, it's analysed and turned into information. Now that information could be communicated. It could be an attitude that needs to be communicated. The attitude of the business towards something that's happening. The business approves of something or it disapproves of something. Perhaps local government is about to introduce some new rule and the business wants to express its attitude of support or of disagreement. So it's possible to send a message of which is essentially an attitudinal message, a message about the attitude of the sender towards some event. And it could be, of course, a need. A need being the sender is requesting something. The sender is asking for some situation to be fixed or for some resources or something of that nature. Now the sender decides the context and appropriateness of the message. For example, your relationship with the receiver, is it formal or informal? So the context of the message needs to be worked out. It depends on whether the sender knows the receiver and how well the sender knows the receiver and what sort of relationship they've got. So it could be a very formal situation. Perhaps one legal company dealing with another legal company, you would expect it to be very formal, very precise. Whereas two friends who are trying to communicate may send very informal messages. It's the sender's responsibility to use appropriate symbols, gestures, words, visual aids to produce the desired response. So the onus is on the sender to send a message that is understood by the receiver. It's not for the receiver to try and interpret, because that may lead to errors. The onus is on the sender to send a message which is understood clearly by the receiver. Clearly, if the sender knows the receiver, they'll know what sort of language and what sort of communications is most appropriate. But as I said, it could be gestures, or it could be words, or it could be visual aids, or whatever. So those are sent to the receiver. Now that's our model again. That's the circular model we talked about. And we've talked about the sender and encoding. So let's talk about the medium. The medium and channel of communications. Well, the medium refers to the method used to transmit the message. So what is the method? How will the message be transmitted? Will it be transmitted by telephone, by fax, by email? Will it be face-to-face? How will the message be delivered? It's vital that the medium is fit for purpose. The wrong medium can cause misunderstanding and confusion and conflict. If a very simple message is wrapped up in a very formal language, you can confuse the receiver. On the one hand, they think this message is very straightforward and it's just asking for certain information. It's very basic. On the other hand, The language and the context of the message could be very formal, which leads to a confusion by the receiver. Do they precisely understand the message? Is there something more to the message that they haven't understood? So it's vital that the message is clear and free from ambiguity of that type. The choice of medium varies depending on the receiver and the purpose of the message. So the choice of medium, if it's something very informal, if it's two friends trying to organize a social event, they might just simply give each other a phone call and have a chat, or send a text. Are you free on Friday night? Fancy having a party? On the other hand, if it's one legal company dealing with another legal company, you would expect them to be very formal in their approach. They may use email. Email is quite acceptable nowadays. Or they may actually write to each other and use traditional postal methods. So it depends on the purpose of the message and who the receiver is. Now, the medium and channel of communication. Well, the choice of medium includes oral communications, simply talking to the other person. Written communications, that's a channel of communications. A channel of communications, which means you could write a letter to the other person, and when they receive it, there has been a channel of communication. The channel is the postal system. If it's a phone call, the channel is the telephone system. An email uses internet. There could be non-verbal communications, which is really body gestures and facial expressions and behavior which indicates a certain message. Now, channels of communication refer to the methods of delivery. There are different methods of delivery. We've got oral communications, written communications, non-verbal communications, and we've got a whole range of delivery methods: telephone, email, fax, memo, letter, face-to-face, radio, media. There are several, so it's quite straightforward what the medium of communications can be. It's quite straightforward if the sender knows the receiver. If not, of course, there is a learning aspect as they try to get to know each other and know what sort of method of communications is most appropriate. Now, the last part I should say here is the decoding and receiving. The receiver's job is to translate and interpret the message. The receiver can only interpret the message if the medium and communications channel is appropriate and fit for purpose. The receiver needs to understand the message, and the receiver must have the facility to receive the message. There's no point in sending an email to someone who does not have the internet, does not have a network. There's no point in trying to phone call somebody, make a telephone call to somebody who doesn't have a telephone. So it's imperative that both sides have the same facility. And it's also imperative that the message is unambiguous. It's clearly understood by both sides. The receiver must decode the message, understanding the message, and provide feedback to the sender. So when the receiver gets the message, they must be able to understand it, to decode the message. What exactly is the message saying? What's the core of the message? What's the essential part of the message? And must understand that and must be able to respond. So they send some feedback to the sender. In fact, sorry, skip forward a bit. In fact, we could look at feedback. Feedback, this phase determines the success of the communications process. Feedback is good because it confirms that the receiver understood the message. It's confirmation that the message has got through. The communications channel was good and the message was understood. It was decoded effectively. Sorry, my PowerPoint slides are jumping all over the place. The receiver acknowledges the message and responds back to the sender. And the feedback could be verbal or non-verbal depending on the medium of communications used by the sender. So, for example, if someone communicated by pulling a face at a meeting, the other person could pull a face back, and there has been communications. If someone looks surprised and the other person looks surprised, there's been communications. Both were surprised. An example of this, well, a simple example would be Emily's workplace organises performance appraisals every 6 months. Her manager has sent her an email requesting Emily to arrange an appropriate time and date to conduct her performance appraisal. On receipt of email, Emily immediately emails her manager to confirm days and times she is available to undertake her performance appraisal. So we've got the sender, the manager, the medium, which is the email, and the receiver, which is Emily, and also the feedback. Emily immediately emails the manager back to confirm the time and the place. So everything is in place. It is the model we've been talking about. Now, interference, I said it's also sometimes referred to as noise. Well, interference refers to any barriers to communications, obstacles to communications. Quite often when a sender communicates a message, the complete message may not be received by the receiver. It may be truncated. It can happen for all sorts of reasons. There may be electronic issues, that the message was sent but only half the message arrived, or the message arrived in very distorted format. Or it could be the area where two people are meeting face to face is very noisy and there are many distractions, so the message is not properly understood by the receiver. Again, interference, or what's known as noise, has got underway. There can be a gap in the communications process which prevents the message being received. So these gaps in the communications process stop the message from being passed completely from one person to the next. It's called interference, or simply called noise. There are many factors that can cause communications failure, such as language and cultural barriers. People think they understand each other, but in fact some of them are translating from one language into another, and that doesn't always work perfectly. So there may be misunderstandings, or there may be cultural barriers. What's acceptable to one person is not acceptable to another, and there's a barrier to the communications. Communications not clearly understood. There could be external noise. As I said earlier, it could be literally noise. It could be two people trying to talk about a particular issue, make some sort of communications, talk face to face, but there's a lot of noise in the background, machinery, cars, whatever it is, and the message is not completely understood because of the distractions and the noise. It could be just simply a faulty communications channel. For example, sending a message down the internet, using the internet. As I said earlier, it could be that an email is received, but some of the message is missing, or an attachment is missing, or some issue with the communications channel has blocked the message. The receiver's personality and attitude could also be a block to the communications. If the receiver's personality and attitude is seen as aggressive and not very pleasant, the receivers may block the message. They don't want to hear. They don't want to be involved. They don't want to associate with that person. So there may be an issue of blocking the message. So there are many sorts of interference. Language and cultural barriers. Well, as I mentioned earlier, it may be the case that people speak a different language, and therefore it's difficult to completely understand the nuance of what's been said, understand precisely what is meant by the message because of language and cultural barriers. And non-verbal communications also varies from culture to culture. What we perceive as acceptable may confuse and misguide and frustrate the receiver. So body language is not a big help with cultural and language barriers. And also there's an issue with the level of education, social status, and this type of sociological issue may block the communications process. For example, the receiver may not be familiar with certain technical terms. They have not had a technical education, perhaps. External noise. Well, as I said, most common in face-to-face communications, as I mentioned earlier. The level of background noise can affect the way we receive verbal communications. So, for example, noise from heavy machinery, like I said to you earlier. Or it could be colleagues and students having conversations in the classroom, which means that the tutor is not being heard by students who want to listen. The communications is being blocked out. There is noise in the system, so the communications channel is being affected. Could also, of course, be affected by heavy rain and loud wind or thunder or whatever. So there are all sorts of external situations that can affect the communications channel. Faulty communications channels, well, channels of communications can sometimes hinder with the communications process. So the channel itself could be faulty. It may be the case that this is electronic and that the channel of communications is not perfectly established, so that the messages are not getting through clearly. But there are other examples. For example, a poor mobile phone reception and the communications channel is being blocked for that, or poor internet connection, as I just said. Faulty equipment such as fax machines and telephones. And the receiver's personality and attitude. Well, the receiver must be willing to accept and interpret messages being transmitted. So the receiver must be willing to accept the message that's coming through. The receiver must acknowledge the message and must almost welcome the message. They must take the message on board. If the receiver simply blocks the message, there is no communications. Simple example, someone receives an email, but the person does not check their emails. The person does not open their emails. The person is selective as to which emails to open. So there's no message getting through. There's no communications. If the receiver is not interested in the message, this will impact on the accuracy of the information being received. So if the person does open the email, let's say it's an email we're talking about, if the receiver opens the email but is not particularly interested, then the importance of the message may be overlooked, or they may simply underestimate its importance and deal with it later. So the attitude of the receiver is very important. The attitude of the sender is also important. If the sender is seen as aggressive and a bit bullying in the way he or she wants communications dealt with and work done, that may cause a grievance on the other side. So there may be tactics to try and offset that attitude. One way or the other, there must be, in a sense, goodwill between the two sides. The sender must encode the message so it's easily understood and send the message through an appropriate medium. On the receiver side, they must have the same medium, and they must be diligent about opening the message and treat it with respect and act upon it and send feedback and confirmation that they have received it. Having said all of that, it may just come down to the fact that the receiver misread the message, and there is noise in the system because of the receiver not paying due attention to the communications, and so causing confusion or even conflict. So communications is an important topic. It comes down to the fact that there are two parties, the sender and the receiver. They use channels of communications, media or a medium, to get through. They send the message via the medium or through the channel of communications. The information contained, the message contained, must be encoded and decoded successfully. So both sides have clarity about what is meant. And then the receiver sends an email or some sort of communications back to the sender, a feedback, to acknowledge receipt of the message. And in all of this, there can be interference or noise, and there are various types of interference or noise that we've just looked at, ranging from personality problems to technical problems and so on. And that's all we really need to do in the context of the communications process. So I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.